All right, so we'll be discussing an article from Nature, one of the leading science journals in the world, by Simon Lewis and Mark A. Maslin. And the title of this is, of course, Defining the Anthropocene. It's a journal article. And down here you can see who these two guys are. They're geographers. They're from the departments of geography of two leading UK universities, and this is appearing in Nature in 2015. I draw your attention to these details because this is important stuff for academic research, to really be aware of who your sources are, especially as we get into the realm of peer-reviewed academic journal articles. As it turns out, this is not a peer-reviewed article. It is in a perspectives section, so it doesn't go through the same rigorous process that it would be doing if they had primary research that they were presenting. Here they're reviewing research, and they're proposing, based on that review of other research, a particular perspective or way of thinking about it. All right. So a lot of this stuff should be fairly familiar by now. We get a nice overview of the background of the Anthropocene as a concept and the leading proposals as of 2015, 5 years ago, for when the Anthropocene could be said to have started. We know now that the Anthropocene Working Group has said right after World War II, the Great Acceleration, the bomb spike, right? Some of the things they talk about in here is the consensus view. But it's still an open question, right? This has not been formalized at the highest levels yet. All right, so we get a nice overview, and I really encourage you to read this article quite carefully because it will be very valuable to you when you write your research paper. It will help you frame your argument that we can read ceremony in the context of the Anthropocene. I'm going to show you a little bit now about how that might work. But first, let's look at how they construct their article. We've got the introduction, and they present us with this basic set of concepts, also presented in these tables, of how we can think about the Anthropocene, right? The geologic timescale. We've seen this before in the shape of the spiral. Here we're seeing it as a flat table with our Holocene epoch, according to the conventional view of the geologic timescale, as of 2012, and we're here at 0. And we can go back about 11,000 years until we get to the Pleistocene, the upper, middle, lower, and so forth, with human beings emerging over the past couple of 100 million years. 2 million years. And sort of anatomically modern human beings, Homo sapiens, in the last 200,000 or 300,000 years or so. And civilization as we know it really only taking place, starting to take shape in the last 10,000 years, with the last 5,000 years or so really being the zone in which people start to do things that seem modern to us. Now, the proposals on the table are to look at the Anthropocene as starting at some time in the past and, ending the Holocene or displacing the Holocene entirely, right? So these are possibilities on the table. Now, this is maybe some technical stuff, but please read it carefully. And if you have questions, let me know. We get a nice discussion and definition of what a golden spike is, right? The GSSP. Things that we've touched on a little bit before. How this is determined. We get a sense of how human beings have been affecting the Earth's systems at such a level that it makes sense to talk about an Anthropocene. So pay close attention to this, especially things that have no geological analog. human interactions or human actions may well constitute Earth's most important evolutionary pressure at present. The development of diverse products, including antibiotics, pesticides, and novel genetically engineered organisms, alongside the movement of species to new habitats, intensive harvesting, and the selective pressure of higher air temperatures resulting from greenhouse gas emissions, are all likely to alter evolutionary outcomes. Considered collectively, there is no geological analog. That is, nothing like this is in the record from previous epochs, periods, eons of geologic time. So we get a nice overview of this stuff, right? Again, some of it's a little technical, but I think you can get the gist. And it's important to go ahead and read this and embrace the scientific side of it. We have enough of a framework for understanding at this point. I think that most of it can make sense to you with a little work. We see familiar terms like the megafauna extinction. We began the semester thinking about that as one possible human golden spike back in the Pleistocene. We see the Neolithic revolution here, something we've thought about, along with Gary Snyder and Zhuang and Kidder, as they think about an early Anthropocene, perhaps, that takes place partly in China. We see a few tables that we'll talk more about later that measure things like increases in methane, temperature, CO2. We'll talk more about that later. And then we have this very important collision of the old and new worlds, which is where we want to think about ceremony in particular. People were living in what we call the Americas for a very long time prior to the arrival of Europeans, beginning in 1492. And accelerating ever since. The story of what happened to those people is part of ceremony. Of course, the specific Laguna Pueblo people, but the Navajo and the other people in that region, but also all of those people who had originally come down from the land bridge out of Asia and into the Americas, settled, developed complex ways of life, complex societies, of varying degrees of technological, I guess you could say, development and sophistication. And, the Orbis spike that Lewis and Maslin propose as a golden spike for when the Anthropocene could be said to begin, is all about these people and their story and what happened to them. We had this nice table that I've shown you before, which can again help us think about how we're structuring our semester. Thinking about Cave of Forgotten Dreams, right? Thinking about the origins of farming, thinking about this happening in Asia with rice production in particular. And this is part of the story that Gary Snyder is engaged in and that David Hinton references. This is the period from which Taoism as a form of thought in Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi emerges here as this way of life begins to be infringed upon and displaced by more and more intensive agriculture, the building of cities, the development of increasingly sophisticated forms of technology, right? Higher populations and so on, right? By 1492, Europeans begin to set out with more and more sophisticated sailing technology, bigger and better ships, technology to help them orient themselves in relation to the rest of the world, navigational technology, of course, developing guns as a weapon of war and so forth. And you get this new world, old world collision, which is a big part of ceremony. It's not the present of ceremony, but it is part of the deep past of ceremony. And the stories that inform Tayo's experience and journey are very much, as you'll see, part of this. The Industrial Revolution. And they don't name the Great Acceleration here, but that's what we're talking about over here: cement, plastic, lead, other metals, things that are evidence of everything that's happened in the last 75 years or so as the inventions of the Industrial Revolution are refined and then spread around the world, right? nuclear weapons, a big part of the story too, and a big part of ceremony. So as you guys continue to do or you start to do your research in your groups, you'll be thinking about these things. And this, by the way, this article here is part of what you should be looking at to help you do research. I'll talk a little bit more about how you might use that moving forward. Okay, so that's what we're using this for, to both give us a framework for thinking about the Anthropocene overall. Here's, of course, the Great Acceleration. If you're in that group, you've got a source right here. But also thinking about the story of what happened after 1492 to the 50, 60 million people who were living in what we now call the Americas, and what happened after the Europeans arrived over a period of decades, centuries, up to the present. Okay? Yeah, clearly I've highlighted some things that are important, but I'd like you to read this whole thing, and I'd say reread it. Read it twice, get to know it quite well. Now, if you're doing research, one of the key things that you do as a researcher is find articles that are useful and look at their sources, because you might be interested in some of their sources. Say you're interested in the Great Acceleration, right, which they talk about here, right? Oh, look, so there's a source. So then you would say, okay, well, 108, what is that note? You know, is this useful to me? And here you can see, oh, this might be a source that I'll look up, right? Something from the Anthropocene Review. There's a URL. It's called the trajectory of the Anthropocene and the Great Acceleration. Maybe you look to that source to go deeper into the Great Acceleration, right? You could do the same with other concepts presented in this paper and with other things that you find in other sources as you move forward. You don't find this process so easily in non-academic research, right? This is what academic research is all about, getting deeper into the network of sources, the conversation of scholars and researchers that is taking place, often situated in the notes. This is their works cited, right? And this is how works cited is supposed to work. I can follow your references, and then I can think them through myself, begin to do more work. We can work together on a problem, as you all will be doing with your collaborative research projects moving forward, all right, which will yield for each of you an individual short research essay. All right, we'll talk more about this moving forward on Thursday. Please bring questions about this paper and about ceremony to class. We'll have time for some discussion. All right, have a great day. Bye-bye.